People who pay attention to the legal process and ask me lots of questions, their games generally perform better than people that just sort of drift through and just let me do the work and sign things and return.
You're listening to the Playlist Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Dorr, and today I'm sitting down with Cam Rogers, a man who describes himself as a law-ducer because he studied film and law at the same time and then refused to pick a lane. Somewhere around 200 ship titles have passed across his desk over the years, and he also once dared a television animator into making a video game at a fantasy footy draft barbecue, and that game is Pro Jank Footy. We go back to the Melbourne indie boom, when a developer meetup would pull 250 people and everyone was convinced that the possibilities were endless. We talk about the single contract clause that wrecks more indie studios than any other, the stack of cracked Amiga discs his dad brought home in the 80s, and the strange pattern Cam has noticed about which developers ask him the most questions and which ones ship the best games. So without further ado, this is Cam Rogers. Really kind of excited to dig deep to kind of get a picture of, the games that have influenced you along the way, but also your path to becoming, how would you describe yourself? Is it a digital entertainment lawyer or just entertainment?
I sometimes struggle with that myself lately. I sort of tend to call myself a producer or a law-ducer. I'm somewhere in between those two things. I think it took me a long time to figure that out and actually accept it. It's one of those things where I don't quite fit in with the lawyer group and I don't quite fit in with the producer group, but I've kind of got a combination of those skills just by virtue of my background. But I'm pretty happy with where I've landed.
I do know this is a US kind of based story, but there is a character, I think his character's name's Chunk from Friday the 13th, Part 3. And he was a kid when he made that, but he grew up to be a kind of a quite well-known entertainment lawyer.
Yeah, he did. I've actually met him. I met him at GDC one year. Yeah, he's a very competent lawyer as well. And that's the path that he kind of took. Everybody's different, but he probably got a taste of entertainment early and decided to move into that area.
Yeah, he's popped up on some deal stuff I was involved with, and I just recognized the name as a huge horror movie nerd and then got excited. And the rest of the people I was working with couldn't really understand why I was so excited about this lawyer.
Yeah.
Did you start off in film and then kind of gradually progress into the game side?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good observation. I mean, I studied film at uni and law, and then early on worked for the South Australian Film Corporation and kind of got a bird's eye view of how the film industry sort of worked. Produced a few of my own shorts with a bunch of other people. But while I was working at the Film Corporation, there was a guy on the board named Bryce Menzies, who's a fairly legendary Australian executive producer and lawyer, and kind of got to know him. We had a couple of mutual friends, and he kind of just offered me a job. And so it was this moment where the things kind of collided, and suddenly I was doing film law. And I moved to Melbourne and I really enjoyed the time that I was there. But while I was there, it was very difficult for me to bring in new clients to the firm. And so I started looking around and thinking about what else was out there. And that was, 2008, 9, I want to say. And around the time of the GFC, around the time of the iPhone, and around the time of the emergence of Twitter. And I just started looking around for game dev studios online because it was sort of in the news. And there was lots of Melbourne indie studios that emerged then, Voxel Agents, Tin Man Games, and a bunch of others. That's when I first met people like Matthew Hall, Matt Didden, and it just grew quite organically and quite quickly. So right place, right time, and a combination of personal interest, really.
Yeah, I mean, my career in games probably started, not so long after 2008, in 2011. So it was definitely in that period. And I remember just the absolute wave of indie studios that cropped up. And you go to, an IGDA meetup and it was bustling because
exactly. I remember going to those and there would be like 250 people there. It was a pretty magical time to be in Melbourne at that time. There was just so much energy and people doing all sorts of things, and just really felt like the possibilities were endless at the time. Yeah, it was good. It was a good ride.
Yeah. Shall we talk about the first game that really showed you the possibility of what games could be and sparked your imagination?
There's a few of them. I think like, I suppose there was games that I played when I was a kid that I really kind of enjoyed. I was lucky in the sense that my dad somehow knew somebody that worked at, I think it was Beam or Melbourne House in the 80s. And so we had an Amiga 500 at home, and Dad would just bring home discs, just like random discs. I had no idea what was on them. And we used to just like cycle through them, cycle through them. Some of them were just like weird platformers that I would never be able to kind of identify anymore. I think they were pretty much cracked games, but a few kind of stood out. And I think the ones that really stood out to me and my brother at the time were probably, there was Stunt Car Racer, which is a pretty kind of a well-known game. I was actually talking to somebody about that yesterday. I think that was one of the first games that had kind of like multiplayer cars, which was awesome. It was quite difficult, but it was fun. And so that was kind of my first kind of experience into getting into games, because I was sort of somewhere between a film nerd and a kind of a games guy. Moving ahead a lot later, it was probably once I started getting involved with the Free Play Independent Games Festival around 2011. So this is much later. I started seeing how people were approaching these projects from a creative perspective. And that sort of started to resonate with me, having worked with filmmakers quite a lot and seeing about how they thought of their craft. And, Free Play at the time, and still is, was about exploring the idea of what games could actually be, challenging those kind of notions. And I think that for me, once I started to think of it along those lines as an art form in its own right, is when things really changed. And I started to really go deep into more of the indie scene and thinking about those types of issues. So it was a bit of a slow burn. Definitely been playing games since I was quite young, but there was no kind of like light bulb moment where I was like, this game really kind of triggers things for me. I think there was some cool games along the way. Yeah, some very familiar ones like Katamari Damacy and things like that really kind of, I was like, wow, that's a new kind of concept that definitely planted some sort of seed. But it wasn't until much later that I started working with the developers and the community that I realized this is an amazing art form, and Australia has got some really amazing practitioners in this space.
It's funny, I come from a film background that I then went into games.
Yeah.
I also have a very similar kind of, excitement about the medium and how the medium can be used. And that's what brought me into games as well. And I do think, given the amount of indie devs and the kind of passion, and there is kind of the same grit from independent film in Australia does bleed over into indie games in terms of thematic approaches, but just also the way things are put together, and I think there is a very passionate, rough and ready, making sure the vision is preserved ethos, which is, really evident in, Australian games over the past 15, 20 years.
I think you're starting to see there's a few studios out there that are dipping their toe into both. We made a thing here in South Australia with the produced Lesbian Space Princess, and also Box Night, which was just a day of the devs. Speaking of Powerbomb, which I'm closely involved with, Dave regularly works across animation and for Netflix and is now doing games. You've got Millie and Matt from Toot Games. Millie regularly with animation projects, which are sort of like short form animation that goes like online type stuff, plus their games. Like it's definitely, there's more people than there used to be that are kind of skipping across that barrier and working across both disciplines. I feel like it used to be a lot more kind of siloed off years ago, but those barriers are starting to kind of break down a little bit, I think. And from a practical perspective, I talked to Dave Ashby, who works with me at Powerbomb, and he says the process for him in terms of the preparation of the content is identical. It's just the execution and what it kind of looks like that it's changed. So, people shouldn't be afraid of dipping their toe into other forms of media, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think from a kind of audience perspective now, there is much more acceptance of that bleed through or experiences that do have much more, of a narrative focus or an IP focus, because all of these platforms are from, TikTok and YouTube and Twitch, right through to game platforms like Steam. It is all this blending together, and it's a really exciting time. And I still think there's so many untapped possibilities. How did Pro Jank Footy come together with Dave? And how did Powerbomb come together?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, Dave and I have been friends for a while. We're involved in a fantasy football competition, which is like Australian rules football thing. And we're having our draft day, which is when everybody gets together and you've got to pick your team in real time, and we have a barbecue afterwards. And he was just talking about the project that he was working on. And I said, have you ever considered making a video game? Like, he's a massive games guy. He's got, we talk about games all the time. He plays them relentlessly. I said, how come you haven't really ever explored that? He sort of went away and was like, oh, yeah, it's an interesting idea. So I kind of challenged him. I said, look, if you come up with a concept, I'll help you make it. How does that sound? And to his credit, he went away and he sort of came back with this idea of like a Neo Geo NBA Jam style game based loosely on the sport of Australian rules football. And I was like, hell yeah, that sounds awesome. So he kind of went away. We also incorporated via some friends. We're very lucky that we're kind of relatively well connected. And so we met Tyler Roach, who's a programmer that's based here in South Australia that had worked for Mighty Kingdom and a bunch of other places. He also really liked footy, coincidentally. So it was a really good match. And those guys kind of got together. And then my involvement just increased over time as we realized that this was more of a going concern. And yeah, we managed to get EGF funding from Screen in Australia, which is their emerging game fund, the 30 grand fund. And so Dave and Tyler worked on that. And once that we sort of got to the point where we had a vertical slice, that was the point I was like, right, we need to kind of move here. We've got something. This is looking good. And it just built from there. But yeah, that was, we kind of formed our band, like July 2024. And we've been working together ever since. And so the game is now kind of a content block. And yeah, we're looking towards a release later this year, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I remember being at GDC last year.
Yeah.
And Pro Jank Footy was there, and yourself and Dave. And it immediately, like, out of all the titles kind of on display there, stood out as this like amazing kind of NBA Jam style AFL game, but with such a distinct voice and visuals and tone. It really goes to show that that game was developed with its own perspective and its own unique voice. And you can see Dave's talents really shining through, which is important. It very much stands out. So I've got my Pro Jank Footy stress ball on my desk regularly, and really looking forward to the full version being released.
Yeah, the good thing from my perspective is that I work with creators all the time, but Dave's got a real kind of a producer's mindset, which for a creative is quite unusual. So getting things done is something that we are pretty capable of.
I would assume that maybe comes from working in TV as well.
Exactly. You've got to be pretty
because it's the economy and working out how you're going to do things a certain way with a certain budget and time.
Yeah, that's right. And you've got, in the TV context that he works in, he's obviously got he's often got dozens of animators, if not more, kind of assisting him. And it's like he needs to make decisions so that the rest of the system can continue. I mean, that sort of speaks to one of those things about what can various industries learn from each other and in terms of best practice and stuff like that. And I think Dave's gotten into some really good habits around being able to kill your darlings early type thing. If that's not funny enough, it's gone. Like, don't waste time on it. Just move on. Yeah.
Speaking of moving on, we should talk about your second game. So this game, your biggest game of shame. What is the game that you started that you really enjoyed, but that you just didn't hit the finish line with?
I mean, there's been a few, too many recently. I think there's been lots of games that I have grand plans for. So the one that comes to mind immediately is probably Zelda, like on the Switch. I had grand plans for that and sort of got stuck in the tutorial at the beginning. I wanted to play with my son and kind of hang out with him. And I was like, this is just not quite landing right, and wanted to persevere with that, but just couldn't really get into it. And quickly moved on to greener pastures. But everybody's mileage varies, I suppose, with these types of things. A lot of people really love that game. So I'm kind of loath to throw anybody or any team under the bus with respect to the production methodology or anything like that. But it just didn't grab me. I think overall these days I'm just bloody time poor, so it's difficult to get my head around those big time sink type games. Like, Red Dead Redemption is one that I would dearly love to sink my teeth into, but I'm just not sure when if or ever I'll find that time, unfortunately. I think, what I'm really looking for in terms of a game these days is like a polished 1 hour type experience from beginning to end that is engaging the whole time, which again is why I'm typically drawn to indie games more than kind of
Mm-hmm.
triple A's, just because it's often that's kind of the mechanic that they're working with. It's like it's a cool idea, well executed, and that's usually enough for me. Yeah,
Yeah.
again, it's sort of I resonate with the art of games more than anything else, I think.
We've had many years of publishers, and look, I've worked on many kind of live service games, but these endless content machine platforms
Yeah,
for
I know.
games,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and that kind of has for a very long time set the standard, probably more in the AAA space of what games need to be. But I mean, games can be a 1 hour experience, a 30-minute experience.
yeah,
And I agree that it's the impact that it has on you and the way it makes you feel. And that's the crossover with films and games,
yeah,
is really having these experiences which change your perspective on a thing or give you a feeling.
yeah,
But the challenge, I guess, commercially is people look at those shorter experiences and go, how do I make money from this?
yeah,
Um,
exactly. No, it's hard.
uh,
It's like trying to capture lightning in a bottle.
but that's also, I think, a similar thing with film. Film does take a huge amount of it's a leap of faith. So when you pitch a film, you're like, here's my story, and this is what the audience is, but it's a massive creative risk, right? Whereas with video games, when they're being developed and being pitched, a lot more work kind of goes into the breaking down the numbers and breaking down the segment data. And I think shorter indie games are very similar to film in the respect of like, let's take a chance. You've got to inspire everyone to have that dream. It's like the
Yeah,
monorail episode from The Simpsons. It's like
yeah,
getting the troops rallied, and I think that's probably a fundamental difference for indies versus kind of the AAA space.
yeah. Look, I definitely agree with that. It's more like the auteur type thing where it says, either a creative individual or a team of individuals says, all right, this is the idea that we want to execute on really well. Like I think a team like House, for example, is a
Yeah,
good example of that, where they just have their idea and they're fairly uncompromising about it. They just know that there's a quality benchmark that they have to hit, and their pursuit of that is kind of pretty relentless.
yeah.
But they're not going to start making changes to the overall shape of the game based on what they think is a change in market. So definitely, I'd agree with what you're saying.
And that's the kind of dividing line between art and content. Art
Yeah,
is uncompromising, and if you have a particular vision of what you want it to be and feel like, and you don't compromise on that, I think, yeah,
yeah,
that's the dividing space. Because I do feel, video game development in certain respects is just compromises the whole way through, where it starts off as a vision and then due to time constraints and market research and all this other stuff, and
yeah, yeah.
it usually comes out quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
Yeah.
I kind of like that about the games industry though, which is it's just got a bit more of a kind of a commercial tilt to it at times. What's measured as a success is kind of like how it performs, commercially. Whereas you look at the film industry and, films get into multiple festivals and they do this and they do that. But then you look at the overall outcome and it's like, nobody saw this thing. Whereas
Yeah.
games, they're much more targeted on the commerciality of it and its sales. I think that games is such a broad church. There's so much room for that type of thing. There's room for the arty indie games, and there's room for the AAA ones that are there to kind of like be bulk entertainment, maximum eyeball time type thing. Yeah, it's interesting, and everybody's got their own kind of perspective along that line where they sit with their studio and what they're trying to achieve.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to really understand from your perspective, because you kind of mentioned with films, they'll go to
Yeah,
festivals, you shop them around, they get a short theatrical window if they're lucky. And then, a lot of great films just don't necessarily get the audiences. There seems to be a bit of an indie renaissance with Australian films, and a lot of genre films as well. How do you feel the Australian film industry is evolving in kind of the face of a changing landscape? And as a part two to this,
Mhm.
I think there's a bit of a commentary that Australian films don't find audiences in Australia, but do relatively well internationally. Why do you think that is at this kind of current point of time?
I think that in terms of the first part of your question, like, Australian cinema and how it fits in sort of worldwide, I think, there's a real question mark at the moment of like what actually constitutes what is cinema at the moment? How does it get made? What is its audience? Like, all content really is stealing eyeballs from one another. Games is stealing audiences from film, and sort of vice versa. Social media plays a part as well. I think that it is becoming kind of a bit more niche and a bit more like, special to kind of go to the cinema. I think most people are just more than happy to stream content as of when it kind of comes through, and it's getting rarer that people make a date of it or make an event of it to actually go to the cinema. Like, it still happens, and it will continue to happen. But, the economics around cinemas and films and how that all kind of works. Like, first of all, you've got the exhibitor, which is often like a place in Carlton with a large venue that sits empty most of the time. The rent on that is astronomical. You've got to get the films in there. And then to get the film in there, there's this network of like sales agents, distributors, and a whole host of people that have to be kind of paid just for the product to get to the cinema in the first place. So I think that sort of the production methodology and the distribution strategy needs to be refined a bit, which is something that the games industry is quite good at. Games has its own problems, but, the ability to go from developer to audience is pretty clean in comparison to the film. So film industry is definitely facing headwinds internationally, not just in Australia, but I don't think it's, that people said the same thing about vinyl records, and look where we are now, right? So I think it's
Yeah.
always going to be there, but whether or not actually going to the cinema remains kind of like the type of traditional event that people used to make time for, I think that those days are starting to dwindle, and we'll see the disappearance of more cinemas, unfortunately. But as a medium, the films will still continue to be consumed. And
I found it interesting recently. I'm a big user of the Letterboxd app,
oh yeah, yeah,
which is a film community and people
yeah,
review films and things like that. And late last year, they started their own video on demand service where you can rent films, and
yeah,
it's like the Letterboxd video store. I found that like a really interesting model because that community is generally kind of hardcore film lovers. It's not just
yeah,
people who check IMDb, but they've got a passionate community, and now they have a direct distribution to that community. So going back to your point about the kind of changing face of distribution, I think that is a glimmer of hope. Because it's also the films they have on that platform are highly curated. I mean, it can be a little similar to like a movie, for example, but generally, I think Australian films are often considered around the life cycle versus the theatrical. So, a film may have a limited theatrical release because the distributor knows that on video on demand and on streaming, that's where they're going to recoup their dollars for their investment. And that's not great for the future of cinema, but that's the kind of reality of the business right now.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that places like Umbrella Entertainment, they specialize in that, and they understand the economics of it, and they're in a good position to be able to extract the best value out of those kind of rights. But, they're absolute cinephiles over there. They're making it work. But you're right, like the people still like content. And I think one of the things that you touched on then that I think is really important is the idea of curation. So like film festivals and things like that. In an age where Spotify and Netflix and this content just gets fired at you without any kind of real context, the piece that's really lost is that curatorial element. And it's like, if you listen to public radio like Triple R or PBS or whatever, some of those shows are so kind of like tailored and niche, and you get to enjoy the benefit of the individual's taste that's curated that stuff. And I think,
Yeah.
film will probably go in a similar way. The example you gave with Letterboxd is a good one. If there's like communities of people that recommend things, like that's pretty rich territory, and maybe people will gravitate closer to those types of services.
And I think with Umbrella as well, like giving a shout out to Broly, their streaming platform.
Yep.
Broly is a lifesaver. And then they do keep that catalog kind of updated pretty regularly. But that's a really kind of targeted, curated collection of content. It's free if you're in Australia,
Yeah.
which is pretty wonderful.
Australian Classics on Foxtel, if anybody's got that, is just ball to wall, kind of like umbrella back catalogue, and you see
Yeah.
all sorts of crazy stuff on there that you wouldn't see anywhere else.
How did with Pro Jank Footy, how did the umbrella games part of it come into play?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was working on a film called Lesbian Space Princess, and Ari and Umbrella were on that. So I was the executive producer on that, and so was Ari. So that's when he and I sort of started to get to know each other. So we'd known each other for a while, but that was when we sort of started to get a bit closer. It was around the time that we started working on the game. Ari knows Dave because of Danger Five and some of the other stuff that Dave has done, and really enjoys working with him. And I just sort of was talking to Ari and was kind of like, have you thought about doing this? As a film distribution company, there's obviously some similarities there, and he had. And then because I was working with Dave, he really wanted to support that, and we pitched the idea to him, and he loved it. He was all over it. Because if you think about what Umbrellas kind of stands for, it is some of those things that we touched on. Retro, like, it's a curatorial kind of component. A lot of these kind of like thematic influences in our game is also kind of what the Umbrella brand stands for. So it was a good match. Plus, Ari just really likes footy as well, so that was helpful. So it just came together quite organically, and it was like sort of the opportunity that Umbrella had been looking for, I think. And it's been good. That was really, we're really appreciative of their support and their continued support. And we're getting closer to release now, so it's going to be interesting to see how it all goes. The moment of truth is coming.
Do you see like an opportunity for Umbrella to really build up a catalog of games in the future beyond Pro Jank, or do you think that may be a slow process for them?
I think that it's been a bit of a steep learning curve for them. I mean, if it was that easy, like everybody would be doing it. I think that one of the things that people underestimate coming from the film industry going into games is just how hard and time consuming the marketing side of things is with respect to games, and also the way that you market. So, one of the challenges we had, for example, is like we had the game, it's quite editable and shareable because there's lots of kind of funny moments in there. And Umbrella were initially quite reluctant to show some of those funny moments because it's like spoilers, right? Like coming from the film industry, you don't show the last girl or anything like that. Yeah, there was a few kind of those types of things, just in the strategy that's underpinning it and the type of consistency you need with your marketing. Because as you know, like in the games industry, you're really trying to kind of build an audience around your studio, what you're doing, so you can take people along for the ride. The wish list count goes up. You bring people over to Discord, you share content with them, and you try and build a community. It's really quite a granular and kind of steady process that has to happen from the day dot. And it's kind of slightly different to how they do things in the film industry. So I think they found that a little bit kind of like interesting. But they got their head around it, rapidly learning. And I think the great thing for us with Umbrella has been just their willingness to learn and say, put their hand up and go, not sure how we're going to go about this, but let's work together on it. I think from my perspective, traditionally film practitioners kind of raiding the border and coming over to games, it's been almost like, all right, the adults are here. Like, we're going to do it this way now. And game developers are like, okay, cool. It's like, it's happened to me so many times with film producers approaching me and kind of telling me, oh, we're going to do this with respect to the game based on the film. And like, well, it doesn't quite work like that, guys. And Umbrella's attitude was the total opposite of that. It was like, we don't know this space. We're interested in getting involved, open to ideas. And so that's been what was really refreshing.
Moving on to the next game, this game is your biggest disappointment. So the game that you were excited to play, and you turned it on, grabbed the controller, and it just did not live up to the expectation.
I'm kind of reluctant to throw any particular team under the bus. To the extent that that I have had what I would consider major disappointments, it'd be some sort of like AAA game that just didn't land with me, I suppose. Biggest disappointments is that I don't really kind of approach games in that way. It's like, it's the same with films with me. Sometimes when you go watch a film, and even if I don't like the film, there's usually some element to it that I can enjoy. Like I just saw one battle after the other, for example, and I didn't think that was the strongest film, but the music from Johnny Greenwood is awesome in it, and so I was able
Yeah.
to kind of sift through the film and just thoroughly kind of enjoy that. Who's a regular collaborator with P.T. Anderson, for example. And so I feel the same way about games in some ways. There's usually some aspect to it that I like. And I would never kind of not necessarily throw any project completely under the bus. I'd just kind of move on as though it's not completely for me. So that sounds like a fairly diplomatic answer.
It's a super diplomatic answer, but that's okay. Like,
Yeah, yeah. What about you?
yeah.
What game has massively disappointed you, Ben?
I go through phases where I'll play a lot of games for enjoyment, but I kind of feel when you make games and you're, in a large studio, you play a lot with an analytical eye.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
I am going through a phase where I'm not necessarily playing games for my enjoyment, and I've started Resident Evil Requiem, and I jumped into Arc Raiders, and
yeah,
I'm looking at stuff. But I do think, I kind of want to hunt out smaller indie experiences that engage me. I'm looking for a stimulation, and I'm looking for like from a film perspective, I do like auteur films or films where you can really clearly see the personality of the person that made them. And I'm kind of trying to find that in games at the moment, and I'm probably just looking in the wrong places right now. So if
yeah.
you can recommend any indie games, yeah, it would be highly appreciated.
I mean, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a good point you make. I noticed this particularly with films, and now because I'm much more close. Like the thing about being a lawyer or an executive producer is that my whole career in games, I've always had a really good bird's eye view down on how these parts fit together. It's like this is the process, this is who does what, this is how this fits together with that. But now that I've actually produced a game, I'm getting so much more of a deeper understanding about what causes issues. Like
Yeah.
okay, you've got like the porting studio can't move forward with respect to the port to a particular platform until you've become a partner over here, and there's a delay here, which means that that's delayed, which means that localization is delayed. Like there's a whole host of the way that these issues bank up on one another has been the thing that I've really noticed. But yeah, I remember just to your point about noticing things, and with respect to like the films, I still do this. You sit there and you're like, oh, that's a great edit, or like, okay, well, why they decided to put the camera on that side of the screen, those types of issues, which really kind of break things up. I think early on, one of the reasons why I think I was successful in the games industry is because I was more arm's length with it. When I was working at Marshalls and Den, I was working with producers, and I was close to films, but I wasn't actually working on them, which kind
Yeah.
of I found frustrating at times. So I'm like, why am I doing this and not that? And with games, I didn't have that so much because it wasn't like I'd always wanted to be a game developer, but gone full circle, here we are. So I guess that
But that
people
I think
change. Yeah.
it's good to approach it with that kind of distance as well,
Yeah.
versus someone who's like, I've always wanted to make video games, and then you get into the kind of production process, and you're like, oh my god, but having a kind of remove from it, I think is a very good advantage, and it allows you to kind of judge things in a more analytical
Yeah.
manner.
Absolutely. I think,
Yeah,
so much of like creative industry stuff is just doing the dirty dishes. It's like
yeah, yeah,
there's so much. Most of my day is just planning things, looking at budgets, working with people, scheduling stuff, figuring out where the blocks are, and figuring out how to fix them. It's like, yeah, you did get to do cool things like go to PAX or Day of the Devs and hang out, and people come over and want to talk to you about things, and that's awesome fun. But that's like the tip of the iceberg below this giant block of dirty dishes work that just has to happen. So
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It's kind of incredible how many devs I've spoken to over the years where your name has come up, because you have worked with so many developers on projects. And, we were talking before, and you said you probably worked on around 200 ship titles.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I'd
which is
say
an
so.
incredible.
I've been very fortunate. I was through probably more good fortune than design. I was sort of being based in Melbourne around that time. I think, one of the other things that I did that we haven't really spoken about is after Marshalls and Den, I took a brief detour through a TV production company and comedy company named Token and Guesswork
Hmm.
TV, and I worked there for 3 years. And while I was there, I wasn't the lawyer, I was more the business affairs manager. So if you think of law and you think of business affairs, they're kind of either side of the coin. Law kind of, the lawyer papers the contract, the business affair manager negotiates it. So I sort of started to develop skills in that area. And when I moved into games, early on, that's what people needed. It wasn't just black letter lawyers to review a contract. It was, is this deal any good? And I
Yeah.
was able to provide that advice. So things pretty quickly kind of escalated once, people realized that I knew my way around a publishing agreement and things like that. And yeah, it's just kind of built from there. Been a good
Right.
ride, Ben.
The ride's still ongoing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oftentimes with indie developers, they get handshake deals, and this is obviously the same for film and many other industries as well. But there's the handshake deal, and people get all excited and ready to kind of pump on. What is kind of the most common contract clause from a handshake deal that blows the deal up or makes it fall apart?
Well, I mean, the one that I am particularly that worries me most is just the term. Like you work really hard on developing your game and getting it ready, and then often people get to the point where a publishing agreement comes along and a publisher sort of bats their eyes at them, and they're so thrilled that somebody would be paying attention to them that they just kind of are prepared to agree to anything. And
Yeah.
the publisher's agreement is probably, the most important relationship because it's the first time that this dev studio is working with the outside world, and it's the caveat to get the game out there, right? And people just don't seem to, the gravity of that relationship doesn't seem to land appropriately. So if you've got like an in perpetuity deal, for example, with respect to a publisher, like if the individual that you're dealing with within the publisher on the other side may be fantastic, but in 5 years' time they could move on, and then you're left with whomever else is in that role. All the nuance and understanding you've got is gone. So you need to have some sort of mechanism to get the rights back in the event things go south. And I think that's probably the main thing that people overlook. It's like, no, this is going to be perfect. In perpetuity is a long bloody time.
Yeah.
And thankfully you see sort of less of those deals than you used to, but they're still around. So that's the one that I'm really big on. I think when I deal with indies, I sort of look at the publishing agreement from the perspective of like, okay, what in the worst case scenario, how do we get out of this? Like, well, what's the mechanism that we can utilize to just extricate ourselves and say thanks very much, even if that's a product of something like you've got to pay back some money. There's got to be some way to end this, and then you work
Yep.
backwards from there. Yeah, and not all publishers
Yeah.
are equal. Some are great, and then some are less great, and some of them are well established, and some of them have been around for 5 minutes, and so you can't treat them all as if they're they're all the same. It's got to be considered individually.
I think that something that is also common is you might do a deal with a publisher, and then that publisher gets acquired, and it could be acquired by a private equity group. And then you suddenly find that the approach or demands from the publisher have changed. So I think you've got to keep those things in mind that, yeah, to your point, the person that you deal with the publisher is not always going to be there.
Yeah.
Or they might get different bosses who have crazy mandates and want to do ridiculous things with the IP. So
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
You got to remember that these relationships are long, and this document is the only mechanism you've got to control things from this far out. As you said, rights can change hands. So how do you do that? Normally, you like to have a change of control clause in there. So it's like if you do decide to sell, we have the option to take our rights back, just so that we're not suddenly working with a completely random company. But all these points are pretty hard fought. Like nothing kind of comes easy. Yeah, so it's definitely something I would just encourage people that to examine the deal carefully and think about their needs and the rights that they're letting go or that they're licensing, because yeah, these are long-term relationships with significant implications if things don't go well. Yeah.
Moving on to the next kind of game chat. What game has been your biggest discovery, say, in the last 12 months?
Some of the stuff that my son's 13, and so he's usually my kind of like my talisman into some new stuff that I'm quite interested in, like what young people, much younger people, like teens and stuff, are into and the way that they kind of engage with things. And so I'm always interested to see what my son gets into, not so much from the perspective of like, I want to play this, but because I think it's a useful way for me to go, all right, this is the barometer around like what is coming up and how people engage with games. And I think some of those like super social games like Peak, for example, I find really interesting. Like I never would have predicted that game's popularity. And
Yeah.
yeah, my son kind of got me into that, and I sort of see it now. There's also Paddle, 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 which is another one of these like kind of collaborative kind of games. So I found that really interesting, but they're not necessarily the type of games that I would play myself. I think, I tend to play more games kind of on my phone than I do, just because that's just where I've kind of got time by myself to kind of do things. So I'm always on the lookout for cool games that come through that way. So some of the stuff on arcade really tickles my fancy. The golf and things like that, I sink a bit of time into. I like those sort of like games I can just drop into and out of very casually at this point, just because I've got so much on. But my appreciation for games is quite kind of academic in that sense. I like seeing what people are doing and how these things fit together. I've got a fairly executive producer type mindset with this stuff, man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And arcade is such a great platform because it does feel very curated.
yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah, with a wide variety of material.
yeah,
I have a question I've been burning to ask for a while, and
sure.
this involves brain rot and IP.
Yeah,
So going back to your comment about, seeing what your son is into,
yeah,
I have a 6-year-old son, and he is just brain rot obsessed, and went through the whole phase with the Italian brain rot characters, and his friends are into them, and when you think about brain rot as a movement, it is AI first. It is not owned really by any kind of IP rights holders.
yeah,
And it's punk rock for kids
yeah,
because it's its own language. It's aesthetically ugly. It's prevalent, but from, traditional IP owners or publishers or people trying to who like to package things up and commodify. What is your take from a legal perspective on the kind of brain rot movement? And then the second kind of part to that is, I think Fortnite are getting some official brain rot skins that they're selling. There's a Steel brain rot movie based on the Roblox and Fortnite experiences in the works. So, if somebody wanted to make a brain rot game, what are their legal protections in doing so? And B, how do you think it bodes for the kind of future of IP? Because it's a very unique IP in the fact that it doesn't feel owned.
yeah. I
I'm
mean,
going to stop talking now.
yeah, it's also just very fast. It's like fast iteration stuff, which I think, to take it back a step, I watched like The Labyrinth with the film The Labyrinth with my son a while ago. And my recollection of that film when I was a kid was like fast paced, this is awesome, let's go, let's go. And he was sitting there and like, the peaks, yeah, for sure he was into. But like he was almost like just drifting off during the
Yeah.
lulls. And I think, the attention span which is probably like a byproduct of the way that media operates, social media and, YouTube shorts and things like that, just sugar hit, sugar hit, sugar hit, lends itself to what brain rot's about. It's like fast iteration kind of slop that makes a funny point, but is fairly disposable off the back of that. I don't know that I would be beginning like a media empire based on such sort of shaky infrastructure as that. I think
Yeah.
it's more, as you said, a punk rock type thing where it's like, you build quickly, build an audience fast, and just keep iterating on stuff and just try and keep people engaged. The artistic integrity and the longevity of that is questionable to my mind. But did I read recently that someone like Michael Bay has optioned the Skibbity kind of universe? I don't know.
Hmm.
So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's probably not for
I
me.
think that the Skibbity Toilet universe does feel a little bit more like an IP in terms of it did have a creator,
That's
a
right.
source of
Yeah,
origin,
yeah.
whereas Brain Rot is just like free range,
It's just free range. Just
mayhem.
go your hardest.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody's going to be able to harness pure brain rot and kind of claim some sense of ownership over it. I think A, that would be difficult from a legal perspective, and B, there would be public backlash and probably ridicule. So it
yeah.
wouldn't be a wise move.
I think from like a kind of Hollywood perspective as well, brain rot is like lunatics running the asylum
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
sucks in all the eyeballs, gets all the engagement, but they can't, like, they're trying to grab onto it and it just slips through their fingers.
yeah.
And I think by the time you would release a Steal a Brain Rot movie, that trend will be fully dead, probably.
Yeah, that's right. It just
Yeah.
moves so quickly. You're probably more likely to see elements of it,
Yeah.
that sort of start to creep into more mainstream media to appeal to that kind of stuff. I mean, the Minecraft movie was a good example. It's like I think that film is, I've never seen a film that understood its audience better than that did. There's the
Mm.
way that everybody was sitting there yelling out chicken jockey and all the rest of it. It was quite an experience. I went to see it with my kid and he was like, "Look, "Oh, wait, Dad, when he says this is going to be big." And then everybody in the audience just exploded. Popcorn goes up. And I think, those types of collective experiential things is something we could see more of. I think that was a really well executed kind of idea based on a fairly broad and abstract concept, albeit one with that there's some themes and concepts and characters that are all mutually understood. But they did a really good job of tying some of those things together in a way that people engage with. So that type of thing I can get behind.
The next question, this is going back to indie devs,
Yeah.
but say you had a really small, indie development team and they wanted to, ship a title on multiple platforms and license their, IP for merch if they had really ambitious plans. What happens when you work with indie devs who have grand visions, and how do you help them from a legal perspective harness the vision so it's not so risky?
Look, I think that's one thing that whenever you're dealing with a publisher, you need to ask some forthright questions about who the publisher is and what they can do. There's no point if you've got like a strategy game. There's no point working with a publisher that does party games.
Yeah.
And similarly, it's like it's all well and good for the publisher to be seeking to take cinematic rights and things like that. Have they ever actually made a film? Do they have those networks? So I think too often the developers they're kind of like, they give up too much without asking the right questions. Like not all publishers' agreements are the same. So you need to be careful about what it is that you're giving it away. You're going to remember that you can license these rights by kind of category and media, by territory, or by term. And so this is why sometimes a publisher might be a really good fit to distribute your game in Japan, but less so in Denmark. Like
Yeah.
you got to think about strategically about how these things go. And just because a publisher comes along and says, "Yeah, we'll cover the porting to here, 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 and here," it's like, well, how is that happening? What is the quality of the porting team, and how much is this costing? Because it's all well and good to kind of say, yeah, you want to go really broad on heaps of platforms, like awesome, but that's money that's being spent that's got to be recouped off the top. So you're just putting yourself further back. So you got to think about these things. It's not, sometimes there's a really good reason why you want to go wide on platforms, but you can build more incrementally and try and develop a bit more of a strategy based on other games that are similar to yours that have done really successfully, and think about what elements of that you can replicate. It's not just about doing as much as you can right now. It's about building
Yeah.
that audience and taking people along for the ride.
I think we're kind of coming to the close of the conversation in terms of, talking about the different kind of games. So
Yeah.
we're heading up to the final boss game that we like to call it. So this is the game that you played and it fundamentally altered your perspective on games or impacted your career. What is your final boss game?
I mean, there's been kind of a few. Like, I think GTA, the whole series, that's a series that I've played ever since the first version until now, and I'm waiting for GTA 6 like everybody else. Like, I think it was GTA 4 was particularly amazing for me just because of the depth that was involved in that game and the way that it really blew things wide open. But right down to the fact that like the radio stations that you could listen to, there was a guy, Hans Oberlander, and he used to play like sort of like Detroit techno and electro and all this kind of weird sort of German stuff. And that was the first time I sort of engaged with a game that actually expanded my mind in media outside of the game itself. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it piked my musical tastes and interest as well. And so that was quite a groundbreaking one when I started to realize that massive cultural artifacts that touch on all types of industries, not just gameplay themselves, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yep.
that was pretty mind blowing. I think when I realized that this can touch all aspects. It can be a whole universe of content and creativity that all gets stitched together in a really unique way.
I had no idea you liked kind of old school Detroit techno house
Yeah,
music.
yeah, that's right. I used to go
Um,
to hang out at the warehouses in Melbourne back in the
yeah, me
day.
too. Yeah, like the
Yeah,
hardware parties.
hardware parties, all that type of
Yeah,
stuff. Every picture
I
tells a
s-
story. All those types of things was yeah, yeah. It's
yeah.
funny where all that crowd has ended up over the years, but yeah, we're still around.
Our studio the old Fire Monkey studio used to be in Docklands, but I tell the young people now about Docklands and the warehouse parties, and I don't think they believe me because it's a little bit more gentrified.
No,
But my favorite hardware party was I saw Laurent Garnier.
wow,
Uh, he was an incredible French producer,
yeah,
DJ, and he came with a 6-piece band. It was like the most incredible experience, and it's still kind of burned into my brain to this day.
yeah, for
But
sure.
yeah, great time for Melbourne. I kind of wanted to end with talking about this is the thing that I think is fascinating to me, and I'm really keen to get your perspective on making product for money or making product for art's sake, but still landing okay with money. What are your feelings on this? Like, do you feel you lean more towards commercial products that monetize really well, or do you try and help people achieve creative vision first with, safe monetary padding around that?
Well, I think the interesting thing is I've been fortunate to work with a few studios over the years and see their production methodology. One of the insights that I get, which is an interesting one, is that people who pay attention to the legal process and ask me lots of questions, their games generally perform better than people that just sort of drift through and just let me do the work and sign things and return.
Yeah.
There's an attention to detail component that seems to lend itself to better commercial success. But in terms of the actual creative process, my observation is, the teams, it's about a good idea well executed. And if you focus on that, like, the commercial success is more likely to kind of come. I don't think it's really a case of like, yeah, certain studios definitely do this with analytics and so forth, and some are really data driven and they look for gaps in the market and they build to that and they execute based on that type of thing. And there's definitely room for that, particularly in industries like mobile at the moment. But then the games that I'm really gravitate towards are just teams that are just uncompromising in the idea and the way that they execute, and they're meticulous. You think about games like Unpacking and things like that, the level of detail and some of the questions that team came to me on with the legal questions was so specific, and they just
Mm.
wanted to get every detail right. And I just had a feeling as that was going on, that it getting developed, that was going to do really well. So that's just one example. But yeah, I think focusing on the quality and originality of the idea and executing it really well is the kind of the North Star of what you should be aiming for. Yeah.